Hey tribe, welcome back. In today's video, we're going to be going over the topic of safety with a focus on Adult Protective Services or APS. So as a mandated reporter, we are obligated to report any signs of abuse or neglect, even self-neglect, financial exploitation, anything of that sort. So stay tuned. Okay, so let's jump into it. So as you know, I like to go right to the source, and the source we're going to be using and going over today is from NAPSA, the National Adult Protective Services Association. And they lay it out nice and clean for us right here. Types of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. So for physical abuse, this may include slapping, hitting, beating, bruising, or causing someone physical pain, injury, or suffering. This also could include confining an adult against his/her will, such as locking someone in a room or tying him/her to furniture. So if we got a question on the exam that mentions within the question that their caregiver, adult children, whoever that caregiver person is, confining them to their living environment, tying them up or anything, that will warrant a report. And we're going to cover more of this in a second. Then there's emotional abuse, involves creating emotional pain, distress, or anguish through the use of threats, intimidation, or humiliation. This includes insults, yelling, or threats of harm and or isolation, or nonverbal actions such as throwing objects or glaring to project fear and or intimidation. So kind of giving that certain look where again it's conveying like a threatening type of a glare, like type of thing. Sexual abuse includes physical force, threats, or coercion to facilitate non-consensual touching, fondling, intercourse, or other sexual activities. This is particularly true with vulnerable adults who are unable to give consent or comprehend the nature of these actions. And when we scroll down, this is very helpful right here. What are some signs of abuse and when to report checklists? Because remember, on the exam, these questions can be worded in an infinite number of ways. And I don't say that to overwhelm us. I say that to say, hey, let's just focus on when to actually report, no matter what type of example they give within that question. I say treat these questions like charades, where, hey, social worker, what are they describing to us in the question? Are they describing abuse to us? Because if so, we want to report that, or do we need to just gather a bit more information? So, what are some signs of abuse? Again, just things to be mindful of: bruising, unexplained bruising, strangulation, fractures, burns, bed sores, over or under medicating the victim, not wearing appropriate clothing to the weather, such as long sleeves when it's hot, controlling access to or the movements of an individual. And again, this this person had a bruising on them. That's a report. That's a report. Not necessarily, right? We need to see some more information, but these are signs to be aware of. And then we have again over here, when to report checklist. If you witness a life threatening situation involving a senior or adult with disabilities, dial 911. Contact your local adult protective services agency anytime you observe or suspect. And we're going to jump into this in a second. But just as a reminder, APS isn't just for senior older adults 65 plus. It's also for adults with any disability. So they don't necessarily have to be 65 plus. They could be any age as an adult, and if they're getting abused in some form by a caregiver. So, when to report checklist: sudden inability to meet essential physical, psychological, or social needs, threatening health, safety, or well being. Disappearing from contact with neighbors, friends, or family. So, like that isolation, they kind of went ghost MIA out of nowhere. Bruising or welts on the skin, especially those appearing on the face or lateral or interior region. of the arms. Physically abused elders are much more likely to display bruises than seniors injured by accident. Fingerprints or handprints visible on the face, neck, arms, or wrist. Burns from scalding, cigarettes, or in shapes of objects such as an iron. Cuts, lacerations, or puncture wounds. Sprains, fractures, or dislocations. Internal injuries or vomiting, appearing with torn, stained, bloody clothing, appearing disheveled in soiled clothing or inappropriately attired for climate, and appearing hungry, malnourished, disoriented, or confused. So, again, if the question is essentially giving enough information to warrant a report, then the correct answer would be to file an APS report because enough information was provided within the question. And when we scroll down a bit more, what are some risk factors? Family crisis or family members are suffering from stress. So if they're stressing from stress, that's again a sign, a risk factor we want to be mindful of because it increases the likelihood that they would do this. Domestic issues causing violence or conflicts in the home, depression, unusual fears, or sudden loss of self confidence, a noticeable withdrawal and lack of socialization, loneliness, and isolation. Again, these are some of the risk factors to be aware of. And they even have right here, what if I'm not sure? Do you just have a feeling about a situation but can't verify the details? APS professionals are trained to assess each situation based on your report. Your local APS agency will determine how best to respond. But for the exam, so this is more so in real life, that aspect, but for the exam, essentially, with all these different type of examples, situations, things that could occur, we just want to be able to identify, hey, was enough information present within the question, like the details, was enough information present to warrant an APS report? Because if it was, then the correct answer is to file an APS report. But if it's vague, just say like if they just had a bruise, it doesn't necessarily warrant like APS report. Like we do need to see a bit more, but look for these signs within the question and these risk factors. Now we're going to jump into neglect. And the types of neglect are physical neglect, emotional neglect, abandonment, isolation, financial neglect, and self neglect. And they list it all right here for us. When to report checklist. If you witness a life threatening situation involving a senior or adult with disabilities, dial 911. Contact your local Adult Protective Services agency anytime you observe or suspect the following: sudden inability to meet essential physical, psychological, or social needs, which threatens health, safety, or well being, disappearing from contact with neighbors, friends, or family, appearing hungry, malnourished, or with a sudden weight loss, appearing disoriented or confused, suddenly appearing disheveled or wearing soiled clothing, failing by caregivers to arrive as scheduled, or disappearing without notice, expressing feelings of hopelessness, worthlessness, or insignificance, so not really valuing themselves, uh, failing to take prescribed medications or nutritional supplements, blaming self for problems arising with family or caregivers, living in squalor, so or hazardous situations such as hoarding or cluttering, so talking about like their living environment. And then we would scroll down a bit more. What are signs of neglect, like they listed earlier? So, abandonment. This occurs when a caregiver relinquishes his or her caregiving duties and neglects to arrange for sufficient care and support for the individual during his or her absence. So they kind of just leave them without like proper handoff, notice, anything. Then we have emotional neglect, failure to meet the individual's emotional well being, such as providing adequate opportunities to socialize with friends and family and engage in meaningful activities. We have financial neglect, involves disregarding a person's financial obligations, such as failing to pay rent or mortgage, medical insurance, or invoices, utility and garbage bills, property taxes and assessments. We have isolation, involves restricting visits from family and friends or preventing contact via telephone or mail correspondence. And then we have physical neglect, includes failing to attend to a person's medical, hygienic, nutrition, and dietary needs, such as dispensing medications, failing to arrange doctor appointments, changing bandages, bathing, grooming, dressing, or failure to provide ample food to maintain health. So these are all signs of, again, neglect. And when we scroll down, what are some risk factors? Failing to provide needed supervision, abandonment, excessive stress or burden on the caregiver, a lack of resources and support for the caregiver, sudden increase in caregiver responsibilities, and isolation of caregiver and vulnerable adult. So, again, these are some of the risk factors. And then again, it says what to do if we're not sure. Whenever in doubt, we can, report it out. But on the exam, again, if enough information is present within a question, file an APS report. And again, if it's vague, we can just explore a bit more before we file a report. Because again, if it's more on the vague side. Now we're going to take a look at self neglect. What is self neglect for these individuals? Self neglect involves older adults or adults with disabilities who cannot meet their own essential physical, psychological, or social needs, which threatens their health, safety, and well being. This includes failure to provide adequate food, clothing, shelter, and healthcare for one's own needs. And what are the signs of self neglect? Isn't going to the doctor, isn't taking medication as needed, doesn't have food, inadequate nutrition, lives in unsafe housing conditions such as a lack of heat, electricity, or running water, has poor personal hygiene, and lacks slash won't allow needed help. Again, signs to be aware of. And what are some risk factors of self neglect? Recent widow or loss of a loved one, worsening medical problems or a physical disability, lack of outside contact, isolated from friends and family, lack of a caregiver, cognitive impairment, or dementia. And again, these are some of the things to be aware of. So if it's speaking to some of those things within the question, and if enough information is present, we will file a report. Now, let's look at financial exploitation. So they have theft, fraud, real estate exploitation, contractor exploitation, and lottery scams. Oh man, especially those lottery scams. What is financial exploitation? Financial or material exploitation of a senior or disabled adult typically includes the misuse, mishandling, or exploitation of property, possessions, or assets of adults, the use of another's assets without their consent, under false pretense, undue influences, or through coercion and or manipulation. Assets are commonly taken via forms of deception, false pretenses, coercion, harassment, duress, and threats. And here are some of the common signs they listed. So again, there's theft. This involves assets taken without knowledge, consent, or authorization, may include taking of cash, valuables, medications, other personal property. There's fraud. This is definitely a big one. Involves acts of dishonesty by persons entrusted to manage assets, but appropriate assets for unintended uses. May include falsification of records, forgeries, unauthorized check writing, and Ponzi type financial schemes. Real estate. This involves unauthorized sales, transfers, or changes to property titles, may include unauthorized or invalid changes to estate documents. And contractor, this includes building contractors or handymen who receive payments for building repairs but fail to initiate or complete projects. May include invalid liens by contractors, so just them kind of taking advantage. And then this is a this is a big one. The lottery scams involves payments or transfer of funds to collect unclaimed property or prizes from lotteries or sweepstakes. And then when we scroll down, again, What are some signs of financial exploitation? Unusual financial activity, so large bank withdrawals or use of ATMs or credit cards not normally used. So just kind of like just odd activity going on, unusual. Missing checks or missing bank statements slash records, addresses or names have been changed on accounts, purchases made without the individual's knowledge or consent, newly authorized signatures on accounts or forged signatures, evidence that the person fell victim to a scam, missing belongings, change to a financial power of attorney. And real quick, notice how this are signs of financial exploitation. It's like, wait a second, Ray. Hey, I'm caring for older adult, grandparent, older parent, whatever the case may be, and we had to change the power of attorney for this reason and everything. Again, it's not a guarantee, but on the exam, we want to pay attention to those things because I mean, of course, if it all checks out, it makes sense, like it was done in good faith, and of course, um, the adult with disabilities or the older adult, whether it's like a grandparent or parent, if they're in the know and they're giving consent for all that to happen, all good. But this is when it's not to their knowledge, unknowingly doing this stuff. Change of ownership of bank accounts or the deed to a physical property, such as a home. Then, when we keep scrolling down a bit more, what are some risk factors? Excessive spending or financial donations, no oversight of finances, unaware of technology or modern payment methods, cognitive impairments or dementia, and social isolation. Now, let's jump into two practice questions related to Adult Protective Services or APS. A social worker visits an 81-year-old client with dementia who currently lives alone after the recent loss of their spouse 2 months ago. The client appears disheveled and unable to recall the last time they took a bath. How should the social worker respond next? A. Contact Adult Protective Services for support. B. Ask the client if they have access to grooming supplies. C. Provide the client with a list of resources for community support. Or D. Help the client reflect on the positive memories of their spouse. You know how we do? Take a sec, reread through the question, reread through the answer choices, pause, select your best answer, unpause the video, and then we'll dive into the explanation. Okay. If you picked A, contact Adult Protective Services for support, you are correct. Why? So, enough information is present to warrant an APS report. The client shows signs of self neglect, of being disheveled, and not recalling basic self care routines of bathing. And notice how this wasn't any like abuse, like a caregiver doing this to them. We highlighted self neglect within this question here. Also, the client has dementia and lives alone after the recent loss of their spouse, which increases their vulnerability. And then we look at B, ask the client if they have access to grooming supplies. This is incorrect. Why? This option only addresses a minor aspect of the client's needs, so like the personal hygiene, and does not consider the broader issue of self neglect and the immediate risk to the client's health and safety. C, provide the client with a list of resources for community support. This is incorrect. While community resources are beneficial, they do not guarantee immediate and comprehensive intervention, especially given the client's cognitive impairment and recent significant loss. And then D, help the client reflect on the positive memories of their spouse. This is incorrect. This option, while emotionally supportive, does not address the critical issues of self neglect and safety due to their cognitive impairment and living alone without assistance. So that's why this one is A, contact Adult Protective Services for support. Now, let's go to practice question number 2. A social worker meets with an 81-year-old client to complete an assessment. During the meeting, the client says they are having difficulty organizing their medication and completing other small tasks. How should the social worker respond next? A. Contact Adult Protective Services for support. B. Explore the client's current support system. C. Provide the client with a list of resources for community support. Or D, request the client meet with their primary care physician to discuss care options. Again, pause the video, reread through the question, reread through the answer choices, select your best answer, unpause, and we'll jump into the explanation. Okay, if you picked B, you are correct. Why? So A, contact Adult Protective Services for support. This is incorrect. Simply put, not enough evidence is warranted for an APS report. Yes, a client struggling to organize their medications and complete small tasks does need help, but it's not necessarily self-neglect. They're just like, hey, social worker, I'm currently struggling with these things. We don't even, oh, APS report. No. And we have a better, overall better option here, which is the correct answer B, explore the client's current support system. Why? This allows the social worker to understand the client's living situation, identify what support is already in place, and determine where additional help is needed to make a more informed decision about further actions. Because how about if we're exploring the client support system and they say, oh, I actually do have a family member that can help out, or a good family friend, or whatever the case may be. And they, let's say, were just a little more hesitant to ask for help, but because they identified them as part of their support system, they could say, "Oh yeah, I'll help them arrange their medications and whatnot," and that could be just taken care of. It doesn't necessarily say, "Oh, APS report, APS report." So that's why we want to explore first before we're jumping to the making an APS report. And then C, provide the client with a list of resources for community support. This is incorrect. Yes, this is helpful, but this can come after exploring slash assessing the client's current support system. And then going to D, request that the client meet with their primary care physician to discuss care options. This is incorrect. This could be helpful, but also may not be needed at all. We want to explore what tools slash resources slash support system the client already has, then work from there, right? And again, this option may not even be needed at all. Okay, tribe, that's it for today's video. Again, more of a educational video as a mandated reporter with a focus on adult protective services, or APS, and not just for older adults 65 plus, but also for adults with disabilities that's being cared for. And it's not just when it comes to neglect, also including self-neglect in there as well, coming from the source NAPSA, the National Adult Protective Services Association. And they also have a donation feature right here, make a donation. So if you would like to make a donation to help with the cause, here's the information right here. And I'll also put a link in the description to this website if you want to dive into it a bit more and get more information. And you know how I say, doing at least 2 practice questions a day and 1 practice exam a month. And technically, we did our 2 practice questions a day here, so we just want to stay consistent with our studies so we can go in there, pass our exam, get licensed, and continue with our social work journey. It's okay. We got this. All right, tribe. I'll see you next video.